Good evening, everyone. I'm sure I was able to lip read Sam saying some incredibly nice things about me, but it's a real pleasure to be joining you this evening for what I hope will become a really informed lecture that will really help you to appreciate where we have come from, both policing and the National Crime Agency, and to understand the challenges that are ahead. So I'll now just go to my presentation, which I hope will now be loading. And the first slide. So if I can just have a thumbs up, Winnie, that I've got slideshows there. Okay, so I'd like to think you all know who I am. I'm Simon Bailey, I'm the Chief Constable of Norfolk, and I'm the National Police Chief Counsel's lead for child protection and abuse investigations and for the violence and public protection portfolio. So just a brief overview and a recap, and I know some of you will be intimately familiar with the phraseology, terminology that we use, but I think it's important that for those that are less informed about the subject matter we're talking about this evening, online child sexual abuse and exploitation comes in three primary forms. Colleagues that are working with me in this field will know that by far the greatest percentage of this particular threat is undoubtedly within the uploading, sending, sharing and viewing of indecent imagery of children. And the scale of that, as I will demonstrate shortly, has just grown beyond, I think, anybody's comprehension. Online grooming, the grooming of children by people with a sexual interest in them, predominantly in chat rooms, is nowhere near the same in terms of the scale of the threat, but it is a clear and present threat. And then more recently, we've had to come to terms with the live streaming of child sexual abuse. And it is well documented that here in the UK, we are the third greatest consumer of lifetime directed child sexual abuse and exploitation in the Philippines. Certainly nothing to be proud of. The way the screen is set up demonstrates this is not a hierarchy, but certainly in terms of the volume and the scale of what we're dealing with, it is absolutely as it's set out for you in the slide. Everybody will know that every time a child image is shared, the victim is being re-traumatized. And I've spoken to a number of victims of child sexual abuse and exploitation where indecent imagery has formed part of it, and there is this sense of complete loss of control and the exploitative nature of the image being taken, and not knowing, is that person in the street now looking at me slightly quizzically, have they seen an abusive imagery, an image of me? And it's a recurring impact, and the trauma can last undoubtedly an absolute lifetime. And unfortunately, those victims know that once that image is out there, the likelihood that it's ever going to be completely removed and will not be available somewhere on somebody's machine or have been printed in hard copy is highly unlikely. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, which concluded last week with live evidence when the final days of the leadership response to child sexual abuse concluded, has done a lot of work in understanding the impact of CSA experienced by victims and survivors. And 93% of victims and survivors told them about the impacts of abuse. Now, I'm not going to go through every one of the images on this slide, but it's based on over 3,500 victims. It's a good number that have shared their experiences with the Truth Project. A lot more have shared their experiences with the Truth Project now, but you can see, unsurprisingly, the impact that it can have on relationships, on employment, upon mental health, to name just two in that slide. And then, of course, we are becoming increasingly aware of the impact of adverse childhood experience on criminal behaviour. Hardly a great surprise that it will have a significant impact upon your own sexual behaviour and the avoidance of phobic reaction to sexual intimacy. So increasingly we are becoming more and more knowledgeable about the direct impact upon victims and survivors. And there is no doubt that ICSA has greatly enhanced our levels of knowledge and understanding of victims that have had the confidence and courage to come forward and talk about their abuse. So I think it's really important when we are talking about the challenges that we face, that we go back to probably the first evidence that I've been able to find around child sexual abuse, and in particular indecent imagery. Sorry, the child sexual abuse was absolutely perceived at that time as a local problem, and we will all be familiar, I suspect, with the campaigns that were run around stranger danger, and actually it involved.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I'm not sure that we're seeing your slides properly.
Right.
You just need to make it full. Start your slideshow and skip through like that. I'm so sorry to interrupt.
That's right. So can you see it?
We can see the PowerPoint screen, but the slides aren't full screen, and we're still on the title page.
Right. Forgive me. Okay. Because I'm looking at a full page here, Winnie.
Is it on a second screen, or is
yes,
it on your...
it's on a second screen, yes.
Okay. Apologies. Sorry about that.
Right, so right, just hold. So
Yeah, that's better. We can see the screen. This slide you're on now.
So you can see it, and it's okay. Good. As long as you can see it. So that's now the full screen, is it?
It's not full screen, but we can see the slide you're on. Before it was just the start page.
Okay, so forgive me. So in terms of the 1990s, it was very much a case of the challenges around stranger danger, and offending was very much focused upon access to a child. And there was a restriction undoubtedly or the restriction through geography. And when you actually look at indecent imagery at that time, it was really a fraction of what we are now seeing. And when you look at the challenge that we faced then in comparison to what we face now, the reality is stark. So you've heard me talk on a number of occasions, I hope, about the Home Office study in the 1990s or 1990. There was a Home Office assessment, an estimate of the number of hard copies of indecent imagery in circulation, and it stood at approximately 7,000. Roll the clock on 5 years, Greater Manchester Police seized, and that's the second biggest police force in the country, 12 indecent images of children, all on video or paper. And in 1999, this figure had risen to just 41,000, with all bar 3 images then held in electronic format. So colleagues will be aware that in 2013, the Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, as it was at the time, approached law enforcement, the NCA and policing, and highlighted their genuinely held concerns and rightly held concerns about what they saw as a poor response from the police service to the opportunity to target offenders viewing indecent imagery of children. The portfolio for child protection at that time, up to the end of 2013, sat within the National Crime Agency, and actually the ability to influence and negotiate with chief constables was limited. So when I took over the portfolio in January of 14, I was presented with a critical incident for policing, and that critical incident was going to be an incredibly critical assessment of policing and our response and our lack of activity tackling the online threat. So working hand in glove with the National Crime Agency, from April to December in 2014, 45 forces. So I think it was every force in England and Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, delivered against the operating model that was known as Operation Notarise. And during that operation, which lasted a number of months, we were able to arrest nearly 800 offenders. We seized over 9,500 devices, safeguarded over 500 children, and identified well over 100 individuals in position of trust. A significant success for policing, a real success in terms of demonstrating the strength of the NCA and National Police Chiefs Council partnership and the regional forces. And what it did, it highlighted what was possible and actually what we now should really be thinking about doing. And I'll come on to talk about that in due course, because obviously things have continued to move on at a pace since 2014, and now quite where all those years have gone, I'm not sure, but the change has been significant. So when I now look at the work that we are doing, when you look at, we are seizing on average 11 to 12 devices every warrant that's being executed, and that on average there are 1,100 or 160,000 images, sorry, to view on average as a result of each warrant. It gives you some idea of the scale of what we are dealing with. And with that, of course, has come a significant number of real complex challenges. Every force in the country has, in response to the threat, so this is from 2014 onwards, we've gone about creating specialist POLITs, OLITs, SCOLTs, you name it. We've now got our respective online teams made up of police officers and police staff. We have created through additional Home Office funding an analytical network across our regional organised crime units, and we've established a prevention network working with the Children's Society. I've led on pieces of work looking at suicide prevention for offenders, and we are now in the throes of doing a really important piece of work, which is looking at the impact that we are having on the partners and victims of indecent imagery offenders. I've now engaged with a number of partners and family members of offenders, and the impact that we have, be it a knock on the door or an early morning raid or even a voluntary attendance at following information. The devastation on a family is something that's difficult to truly understand and appreciate. And what happens when we leave the house or the property, whatever it might be, there is this huge chasm that is left that families find difficult to bridge in terms of what has happened to us, why has it happened to us, who is there to help me, who can I talk to, because my world has been thrown into absolute turmoil. And I hope that 2021 will see all of the police officers and police staff that work in this field on this lecture this evening, equipped with the ability to leave a pamphlet with every family, with every partner, that will allow them to provide the reassurance and the confidence that actually they know they have somewhere to turn, they know they have somebody to talk to. So that piece of work is ongoing, and at the same time another group is working at a similar document that will exist for offenders, that every offender in the country can be given a document that talks about where they can get help, where they are able to provide counselling and support, because what I'm really keen to do is try and prevent as many suicides as we can. And increasingly, there are more and more groups that are offering counselling services, courses to help offenders, and we should be actively encouraging and pointing suspected offenders in the direction of those groups so that they can seek help at the earliest available opportunity. Because at this moment in time, we knock on the door, we execute our warrant, we deal with the suspected offender, and of course in so many cases they are then either released under investigation or bailed, or simply no further action is taken whilst the decision is made. And at that point there is the suicide risk, but of course there is also the reoffending risk.
Simon, I'm so sorry to interrupt you again. Just to let you know, I'm controlling the slides now, so if you could just let me know when you want to go to the next one. And apologies to everyone in the audience for the interruptions.
So next slide, please. Thanks, Winnie. Now, again, those of you that have heard me talk at the ARU PIER events, I'm really passionate about staff welfare, officer welfare. This is some of the most demanding and emotive work that a colleague can do. There is a real high risk of burnout, anxiety and depression, and some of you will have heard one of my colleagues consider ending their lives simply because they couldn't cope with it anymore. There is now national guidance in place that's been out for over 18 months now. There are definite examples of best practice, but I'll share with you an incident that's been, well, not an incident, but a challenge for me as Chief Constable that's been brought to my attention today. A member of police staff has been working in this space now for a number of years, and despite the best possible welfare I can put in place for them, they've now reached the end of their time within this field. Now, of course, a member of police staff doesn't enjoy the security that a police officer does. Now, that member of police staff has raised with me, really legitimately, their concerns that actually there is no mechanism whereby we are giving those members of police staff the opportunity to be redeployed in the organisation in a way that they feel that what they have given to the organisation is recognised. Now, I will now take to my command team immediately after Christmas the challenge that we have now got to ensure that for police staff, people working in my constabulary, operating in this field, they have to know that when they reach the point of not being able to do this incredibly demanding work anymore, that they know they have a job within the organisation. Because my great fear would be, and you can picture this, a member of police staff that has a mortgage, wants to put food on the table, is reliant on the income, fearing not being able to be redeployed, and then just carrying on and battling through, doing themselves more harm. So whilst we've come on a huge amount on staff welfare, even myself as the national lead, I'm still reflecting on the support I'm providing to my members of staff and how I can make it even better still. The peer support, the clinical referrals now exist in Norfolk. There is a great reliance and expectation that supervisors do their job properly. Clinical psychologists are available, but actually I'm not sure that you can invest too much time and effort into this particular subject matter because it is so important. And despite some of the improvements that I will talk about shortly, this should be at the forefront of all the minds of leaders operating in this field. How do we ensure that our workplace and the health, safety and well-being of our officers and staff that come in to deal with this every day is at the forefront of our mind and is paramount every single day, because we have a duty of care to them. Next slide, please, Willie. So one of the great success stories of the last 6 years has undoubtedly been the development of the child abuse image database. I think it's now approaching 17 million images securely stored, and you can see the statistics on there. It is a trusted hash set of images, and the CADE evolution is going to see so many of the pressures that are currently on you as staff and colleagues working in this field reduced in terms of categorization in years to come, in terms of, I hope, facial recognition, voice recognition, all of which are going to help us with offender identification, victim identification, and far less time having to be spent viewing images. The CADE was put together by a great team at the Home Office incredibly quickly. It has evolved dramatically over the years, and I'm confident that we will secure further investment in the system that will allow us to continue its evolution, continue its development, to afford us the opportunity to say that we have one of the best image databases there is, and the developments that we've put in place to exploit the opportunities that are afforded there to identify victims and identify offenders and protect victims is a world leader in itself. I think we're in a very strong place. The foundations are there. The next stage is now to really exploit the opportunities that's there in terms of that victim identification, offender identification, and also to ease some of the pressures that you are having to deal with on a regular basis. Next slide, please. So I'd be interested to get some feedback in terms of how effective you feel the streamlined forensic reporting has been. It was absolutely designed to get cases before judges quickly, to mitigate the risk to review an excessive amount of images. We have trained the judiciary to work to the streamlined forensic reporting. There is no longer any need to be taking images on discs to court. And to the best of my knowledge, the SFR is still working exceptionally well. But look, I'd really value some feedback in terms of just how well that's working from your perspective as a practitioner. Fast forensic triage is only going to get better. I've gone through a number of iterations here in Norfolk with different tools. We had a van that went on the road, and we tried to do the examination of devices at scene as far as possible. But actually, we've seen a number of systems brought to market which are definitely making a bigger difference to our ability to be able to process the volume of devices that we're seizing on a regular basis. We're seeing quicker referrals from the National Crime Agency. That was brought to the Pursue Board probably about a year ago now, to try and get jobs to you quicker. As you might imagine, I am forever monitoring the demand coming into my online team. My numbers are growing, which means that I'm having to put additional resources in there. And when you actually look about some of the statistics that I referred to lately, unfortunately, I can't say that those volumes are not going to increase, but the referrals from the NCA and the speed at which we're now getting them, I think it is reducing some of the time lag that was there. I've talked about facial matching and our ability to identify more victims. It is slower than I would like it to be. I would like it to be there already. It's not. I think it's going to take some time, but we're sitting on a significant number of facial matching opportunities that I will believe would allow us to go and target a number of contact abusers. And I've talked about the auto-categorization of IOC. I hope you are seeing that. I hope the CADE has relieved some of the burden on you. And again, I'd appreciate and value feedback in terms of whether or not you are seeing it making a difference. Next slide, please, Winnie. So in recent times, we have bolstered our PIER response with a big investment in our undercover online activity. The statistics speak for themselves. From my perspective, the only disappointing statistic there is the custodial sentencing, and we have very recently challenged the judiciary, and through the Sentencing Council, the obscenely lenient sentences, as we perceived, were being handed down by judges on the basis that actually the fact that a paedophile was attending somewhere with all the appropriate equipment that they would want to use to abuse a child, because there wasn't actually a child there and it was in fact an undercover operation, didn't mean and didn't warrant a really significant custodial sentence. That has now changed. It hasn't changed completely. A really disappointing custodial sentence was drawn to my attention last week. We will go back and remind colleagues in the MOJ the importance of getting this right. But look, this is a big success story. I am concerned about the amount of time that online operations are potentially taking to come to fruition from a perspective of activity by colleagues actually making an arrest and dealing with that threat. We need to sharpen that up, because in some cases the forces are waiting too long. But again, I'm looking to manage that. Next slide, please, Winnie. And of course, at the same time that we've been dealing with the really fantastic work that's been completed by our UCOL officers, we've had to contend with the emergence of what became known as paedophile hunters. And for those of you that have been working in this field for some time, you will probably all recall the emergence of Stinson Hunter. We have done a lot of work, and Dan Vicevich deserves a huge amount of credit for moving this debate on. We've moved away from paedophile hunter or vigilante to now calling these groups quite rightly online child activist groups, OCAGs. The number of stings pre-COVID and per month are really significant, and at that point we had over 200 groups identified. I think the number of groups that are still active now is somewhat less, but of course from a public perception perspective, their narrative is the police service can't cope with the demand, we are here to protect children. But you all know they're not vetted, they're not trained, there's no safeguarding mechanism in place, and I have been very strong and very clear on this. I think the primary driver for these groups is simply their own kudos amongst that particular community, Facebook likes, and that type of notoriety that's afforded through social media. They are not putting at the heart of their considerations the safety and the welfare of children. They're potentially compromising our operations. And despite all those things being pointed out to them, and the fact that they could give us the material that they've gathered and let us manage it appropriately, there are a significant number of groups that carry on doing it. And what we are now seeing, unfortunately, is we're now starting to see these groups diversify. And during COVID and post-COVID and the easing of lockdown arrangements, we've started to see these groups go into chat rooms, witness indecent imagery of children taking place, and we've then seen in circumstances where they then knocked on the door and to speak to the parents of the child that has been involved in the sharing of an image. I don't think I ever foresaw that happening, but these groups will continue, I fear, to carry on whilst their contribution to this debate is still seen to be significant. There is still, I believe, a battle to be won in terms of the perception of the public about the activities of these groups, and we have to keep highlighting the work that we are doing, the work that you are doing, the incredible volumes of work that you are turning over in this space, and I think that will slowly mitigate against these groups, and they will then turn around and say, actually, the police are doing so much in this space, there is limited value for us. Next slide, please, Winnie. So, the nature and scale of CSA and child sexual exploitation continues to evolve. I've talked about the figures in 1990. I think we have to recognise that actually, despite all the work that we've done and all the developments of initiatives that I've talked about, the scale, the severity, and the complexity of online activity continues to grow and, quite frankly, continues to appall. Images now will involve infants that are still babes in arms being abused. Levels of depravity are sinking even further if that was humanly possible. And we face the challenge that the online threat is now starting to take up a significant percentage of the overall picture. So at this moment in time, familial abuse still accounts for 2/3 of all child sexual abuse and exploitation. But I can't help but think, as the online threat continues to grow in the way that I will shortly demonstrate, that actually the percentage will start to realign themselves once again. And it is only when I start to talk about the true scale of this, and I will give you the latest numbers, that it really starts to come to bear just what we are up against. So next slide, please. So the NCA this year just gone have revised their assessment of the number of adults with a sexually interested children in the UK. The original assessment was between I think it was 66 and 80,000. They've now revised that up to 300,000. The conversation that I'm now having with Rob Jones in the NCA is that's now looking like a conservative estimate. We are, as I've said, one of the top 3 consumers of child abuse live streaming for the Philippines, and unfortunately, and quite tragically, for between £10 and £20, you can now direct your own child sexual abuse. You look at the sheer scale of the volume of material and the referrals globally in 2018, and I'll come on to the most recent figures. It just gives you an idea of the scale of the threat. And then let's just look at the increase from 2014 and the increase from 97 in terms of industry referrals in 18. I mean, the numbers are just huge. And I guess if I am being critical, so I am very self-critical, one of my greatest frustrations and my greatest disappointments during the course of the last few years has been the fact that I have failed to land in the public conscience the scale of the threat, the risk that is posed to children, and how technology has simply not only facilitated this, but I think in some respects, well, not in some respects, it has absolutely exacerbated the problem. And that's why I'm really concerned about that number of 300,000. I think the next assessment of it will be, and we'll see it increase because of what we're now starting to see in offending behaviour. Next slide, please. And of course, we are all having to come to terms with the challenges of anonymisation, encryption, the sophistication of clever child abusers, and the use of the dark web. And increasingly, encryption is becoming the default setting, and there is now significant offending taking place on the dark web. And all of you that are familiar with this agenda item will be genuinely concerned, I'm sure, about the implications of Facebook's decision to go to end-to-end encryption. Mark Zuckerberg's position is one of, I have a duty to protect data and protect users' data. He knows full well that what he is doing in the most basic of terms is creating a paradise for paedophiles. I can't put it any more strongly than that. That is what he is doing. He knows full well, I believe, that it will not impact upon the Facebook business model in any way, shape or form. And of course, what it does as well, it also mitigates the risks that Facebook would face through the new online harms white paper and the powers that are now intended to be given to Ofcom. We are obviously talking at the highest levels and pointing out to Facebook the risks and the impact that they would have. But at this moment in time, it's a very, very difficult debate. And increasingly, we are seeing encryption and anonymisation becoming more common. And of course, that presents us with the really significant challenge of how we deal with those more sophisticated offenders. And I don't mean sophisticated in a complimentary sense. They are becoming more sophisticated, more adept, more skills at using the technology to prevent our ability to identify them. Next slide, please. Now, this is why I think that the revision will be upwards of the 300,000 offenders. I'm now starting to see increasing evidence of people viewing pornography using sites like Pornhub, and that's the coverage of Pornhub yesterday is a very, very interesting one and absolutely relevant to our lecture this evening. But they are becoming desensitized to all the pornography they're watching, and they are then seeking to get their sexual stimulation from elsewhere. And then what do? Because it is so easy to get hold of, they are then viewing child sexual abuse material. And increasingly, the likes of the Lucy Faithfull Foundation are seeing people seeking help of their counsellors because of that type of behaviour. And there is increasingly becoming a normalisation of behaviours, and actually, for those of you that have been into sex offender prisons, we have one in Norfolk, the PIER prison. There are 600 sex offenders in there, and what you create within that environment is just, I think, a normalisation of behaviour and discussions around like-minded individuals within that setting. But of course, what you then have is you then have chat forums and sites that you have to be able to pretty much demonstrate that you are like-minded and you are engaged in contact abuse to get access to. But once you're in, you are then in an environment within a community where the normalisation of behaviour then starts to take place. And what I'm seeing is, and what the Internet Watch Foundation is seeing, and has seen more so than ever before this year, the increasing and the alarming increase in selfies, youth-produced sexual imagery. 40% of new imagery that the IWF are now encountering is self-generated. Now, that doesn't mean it's all within the confines or the purview of a relationship between two consenting young people. Some of them will undoubtedly be abusive and coercive, but actually that's a really worrying statistic. And how many parents on this lecture this evening know of children that are aged 8, 9, 10 that have got Facebook accounts and have access to smart devices? It is a source of genuine concern to me. Next slide, please. So in terms of the challenges there, and this is just further evidence of what we are having to deal with, just look at the number of counselling sessions delivered by Childline ending in March of last year. Look at the sexual abuse accounted by, well, nearly a half. And I think the research by Radford in 2011 still holds true today, just in terms of that horrific percentage of those young people that are sexually abused. Next slide, please. So these are the worrying figures from my perspective. The latest Pursue Board, which I chaired last week, 850 arrests on average every month now, over 1,000 children safeguarded every month through our collective coordinated activity and the activity that you are doing in your forces to protect young people. Every quarter that I chair that board meeting, the numbers continue to rise. I didn't think that I would see 1,000 children safeguarded on average every month this year. I didn't think I would see that. I'm obviously delighted that we are doing that, but it gives you some idea of what we are facing. And just look and compare that to what took place when CEOP were responsible for the response in the whole of that year to 12-13. That doesn't even account for a week's worth of arrests in our new normality. The worrying thing is that when you then look at the number of cyber tip referrals that have been received by the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children up to October of this year, sorry, including October of this year, they were now at 20 million. And the really worrying element in that statistic is a significant percentage of videos and images that they were now looking at, a big number, and I'm talking millions, were unique and don't believe previously seen before. We know that during lockdown, the human moderators were sent home and the tech companies relied on artificial intelligence. I can't help but fear and feel that there is a huge bubble that is just about to hit policing in terms of what we are now going to have to come to terms with and deal with. Next slide, please. So what are we having to contend with? Every one of you that's involved in a force-based online investigation team will be aware of the demand that is accruing, the backlogs in digital forensics, and a recent piece of work has shown that 60% of digital forensic units' time is child sexual abuse and exploitation, and the sheer volume of material that's now being seized per offender is a number. I'm not sure how many noughts there are with terabytes, but I know there's a huge number. Next slide, please. So COVID, I think we have to accept, as I've just referred to, it was the perfect storm. We saw very quickly at the outset of COVID the real risks to children, because we saw that paedophiles were talking about the opportunities that were going to be afforded to them. You had children spending more time online unsupervised, which under the circumstances is probably completely understandable, but not if you understand what the risks are. And then of course, What was then taken away, and is so important, is that access to professionals, and in particular teachers, who of course are at the front line of safeguarding. They are the individuals that are seeing students every single day. They are noticing changes in their behaviour. They're picking up on something that's not quite right. And whilst social services did a fabulous job trying to maintain contact with those children that were already on their books, what was happening to those children that weren't on their books, that weren't in their care? And my great fear is, and it will only come to pass in years to come, what actually took place during those 12 plus weeks of lockdown will play out, I suspect, for the foreseeable future, as more and more children have the confidence to come forward and report the abuse that they've suffered during this last summer. Next slide, please. Now, we've through the Pursue Board and through the work of Janmar working on my behalf, I'm trying to get a far better understanding of the totality of child sexual abuse and exploitation across the piece. We have great data in the online space, but actually we need to get better data across the whole of the working group. We've seen a big drop off initial lockdown of CSAE. We're now starting to see a return to normal levels, but unsurprisingly, grooming has exceeded the 2019 levels, and that was eminently predictable. And of course, what we have seen is the helplines, Childline, becoming inundated with calls and reaching new volumes. Now, I'm engaged as a result of COVID with multiple charities who I spend an hour with every month, talking about latest trends, talking about latest activities, and I'm now in the process of joining that all up with the Department for Education to make sure that we optimise the opportunities that are afforded to us on the back of COVID, because there have been some opportunities. Next slide, please. So we know that I think we're having to now deal with a new normal. I've talked about the lack of human moderation. I've talked about that influx in demand and the impact upon us on safeguarding referrals. And of course, what has happened is more and more children will become more and more adept at using technology. And of course, from my perspective, that just continues to enhance the risk. So I go back to my previous slide, I think it was at slide 23. There was a perfect storm. There was a huge amount of interest and conversations with government at the highest level to be reassured about what we were doing around all sorts of vulnerabilities and hidden harms. But Rob Jones and I, and Rob on behalf of the NCA, were constant in this respect. With the move away to reliance on artificial intelligence, we were always going to be faced with a significant uplift in time once human moderators came back to work, simply because the AI was never ever going to be able to identify the volume of material that they deal with. And actually, when you then take away the safeguarding presence that school prevents and the opportunity for abuse to take place, it's no surprise that we're starting to see the volume of calls that we're starting to see, and the demand that's inevitably going to come our way. Next slide, please. I hope a lot of you will have heard that underpinning all of this, from my perspective, has got to be the prevention. I'll start with the online harms white paper, because from my perspective, it absolutely is the key to this. Actually, if the tech companies adhere to what I think, or live up to what I think should be their social and moral responsibility, then actually so much of the online harm can be stopped at source. But in the meantime, we've got to make sure that our education, PSHE in schools, all the different campaigns that are available, are brought to the attention of the most vulnerable, and they understand the risks that they are taking. That we absolutely push and encourage offenders to seek help before they abuse, which is why the work of Stop So, Lucy Faithfull, Circles, Marie Collins and others makes such a difference. And there is a growing body of evidence, as I'm sure an awful lot of you are aware, around adverse childhood experiences and the impact it has on children. And I don't want to find myself in the position in 20 or 30 years' time looking at young people, or people that are no longer young, but a generation of people that are, quite frankly, struggling with life because of all the experiences they had as young people, and not be able to look back and think, Simon, you did your best. That for me is absolutely critical. It's a very personal thing, but I think from my perspective, well, not I don't think, from my perspective, that's really important. Next slide, please, Winnie. So huge role for industry. The list there is very, very clear. Industry simply hasn't done enough. It hasn't lived up to its responsibilities. Industry has made billions of pounds from the evolution in the tech sector, but they've done it, I think, at the expense of their responsibility to ensure that young people, children, can go on and use their services safely, and they've done it at the expense of making their environments hostile to people that seek to abuse and exploit. Next slide, please. So I think the image really answers that question. You should be incredibly proud, for the practitioners that are on this lecture this evening. You should be incredibly proud of what you have done and what you have been a part of. We are, I think, the best in the world at tackling the online threat. Nobody is doing as much as you have done in this space. And I wish I could sit here and say this is just a wonderful, wonderful success story. But then I'd be kidding myself, and I'd be misleading you, and I would be being anything other than transparent. The facts are that we have responded to the threat to the very best of our ability, I think, in an exceptional fashion. Nobody could have imagined that we would get to this point when you look at where we came from at the start of 2014. But there's a massive but, and the massive but is despite the evolution of things like the CADE, the streamlined forensics, the on-scene triage, the deployment of more staff, better training, better awareness, better levels of understanding, and despite those phenomenal numbers of children being safeguarded and offenders being arrested every year, the numbers just continue to grow, and they continue to grow at a terrifying rate. And at this moment in time, until such time as the Online Harms White Paper is enacted and Ofcom really starts to go after these people, I don't see that changing. So my pride in what has been achieved in the last 7 years is really tainted by the fact that I haven't won, in the eyes of the public, the argument that actually says the likes of Facebook, for example, are so negligent in their responsibilities to protect children, we're not going to use it. And I've tried, well, I haven't tried, I have now rationalised in my own mind that the reason that we haven't won the argument around the abuse of technology to facilitate abuse is simply because the Apples, the Microsofts, the Googles, the Facebooks, the WhatsApps, the Instagrams of this world have now become so embedded in so many of our daily lives now that actually we are prepared to turn a blind eye. And we are prepared to accept that if we want social networking, we want the facilities that the likes of Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Google offer, then we are just going to park what they are permitting, what they are facilitating, and we are going to ignore it. And actually, no matter what a chief constable or a senior police officer might say publicly, might say with a degree of passion, and might back up with real evidence, it's simply not going to change their views and their perceptions of this, and they are prepared to turn a blind eye. And ultimately, all your success in this field, I think, will only ever be truly recognised when those companies are now held to account, and hopefully Ofcom will hold them to account, and it will then allow us to then go after the more sophisticated offenders that are beyond the ability of the companies to manage. That's our job to do. It will take the volume away and then create the time and the space that I know that you will all crave to go after the Matthew Folders of our world. So I hope you found the last 45 minutes or so informative. I hope it's told a story about the last 7 years, where we were, where we have come from. I think it has captured a lot of the success that you are absolutely responsible for, and has reinforced in your own minds the value of what you have done and what you are doing and the difference that you are making. But it is very much in the context of a world and an environment where actually we can only have at this moment in time a limited impact, and that limited impact is limited to the point whereby it's the tech companies that are going to have to be responsible for preventing so much of what we are having to deal with on a daily basis.